I'm about to show you the most insane revenge plot in history during what's historically known as the Cadaver Synod. This involves a dead pope, a courtroom full of medieval church officials, and what might be the pettiest posthumous prosecution ever recorded. You'll see how Pope Formosus went from being buried with honor to having his corpse literally interrogated by his successor, Pope Stephen VI. This sits at the brutal intersection of medieval politics and ritual law, where cancelling someone meant way more than just social media backlash. By the end of this, you'll understand why they called this the Cadaver Synod, and why it proves that medieval Rome was basically Game of Thrones with more Jesus and way more corpses. How do you officially cancel a pope even after death? Well, you're about to find out just how crazy medieval politics could get. 9th century Rome, where being pope was like winning a death lottery. Between 872 and 965, Rome burned through 24 different popes, and during the chaos around 896 to 904, they were basically installing a new pontiff every year. These guys were dropping like flies, and that's only if you were lucky enough to die of natural causes instead of getting murdered by your own cardinals. Here's what happened. Charlemagne dies in 814, his empire falls apart, and suddenly Rome turns into a free-for-all where every noble family wants their guy sitting on St. Peter's throne. It's like when your favorite TV show kills off the main character and all the side characters start fighting over who gets the leading role. Except instead of bad ratings, the losers get murdered. The Spolitan faction, led by Guy of Spoleto and his son Lamberta, were major players in this brutal game, expecting papal support for their imperial ambitions. On the other side, you've got every other noble family in Italy thinking the same thing about their own guys. The result? Popes are getting installed and removed faster than you can change your Netflix password. Look at these numbers. That's not exactly job security, you know? Many popes met abrupt ends. Take John VIII, who got clubbed to death. Just saying, if you're keeping score at home, being pope was basically a suicide mission with fancy hats. The whole system was completely broken. Noble families would literally buy papal elections, then the next family would overthrow that pope and install their own guy. Thing means you're probably going to end up dead in a ditch somewhere outside Rome. You know what made it even worse? These weren't just political appointments. The Pope was supposed to be God's representative on earth, but everyone knew he was really just whoever had the most soldiers that week. The chair of St. Peter became less about spiritual leadership and more about which family could throw the best bribes and threaten the most cardinals. The papacy's power to crown emperors made the office a prize worth killing for. The Spolitans were particularly nasty about this whole thing. They controlled central Italy and figured that meant they should control the Pope too. When their guy Lambert became co-emperor, they expected the Pope to crown him and basically do whatever they wanted. Any Pope who didn't play along? Well, let's just say they had ways of dealing with uncooperative holy men. This is where it gets really crazy though. The political situation was so messed up that normal revenge wasn't enough anymore. If you just murdered your enemy, someone might forget about it in a few years. But if you really wanted to make a statement, if you really wanted to humiliate your enemies and make sure everyone remembered what happened when you crossed the wrong family, you had to get creative. Medieval Romans were already used to seeing popes get assassinated, exiled, and overthrown on a regular basis. That was just Tuesday in 9th century Rome. So when someone really wanted to send a message, they had to do something that would shock even these people who were already desensitized to papal violence. The whole system was so corrupt and violent that digging up dead enemies for revenge trials actually seemed reasonable to these people. I mean, if you're already okay with murdering popes, why not put their corpses on trial too? Rome had basically become a medieval battle royale where even death couldn't guarantee you'd stay out of the political games. Dead popes were getting their reputations destroyed posthumously. Living popes were getting murdered for the crimes of their predecessors. The whole thing was completely insane, and into this absolute chaos walks one particular pope who's about to discover that climbing the church hierarchy in medieval Rome means painting a giant target on your back. The pope was Formosus, who managed to make enemies across every powerful Roman and Spolitan faction during his rise through the church hierarchy. This guy started out as Bishop of Porto in 864, which sounds like a nice quiet job until you realize that being a bishop in 9th century Italy meant navigating constant political warfare. Formosus gets sent as a papal legate to Bulgaria around 866, and here's where his troubles really begin. Most church officials would go to Bulgaria, shake some hands, bless some babies, and come home having accomplished absolutely nothing. But Formosus actually does his job well. He converts a bunch of Bulgarians to Christianity and makes some solid political connections. You'd think this would be good news, right? Wrong. His success in Bulgaria earned him serious political enemies back in Rome who saw his influence as a threat. Pope John VIII looks at Formosus's Bulgarian success and immediately thinks this guy is getting too powerful. I mean, what kind of bishop actually succeeds at converting pagans and building political alliances? That's clearly dangerous behavior. So in 876, John VIII excommunicates Formosus for allegedly conspiring with secular rulers and getting too involved in Bulgarian politics. Basically, Formosus gets fired from the Catholic Church for doing exactly what they sent him to do. But here's the thing about Formosus, the guy doesn't stay down. He fights the charges, gets his excommunication reversed, and works his way back into the church hierarchy. The road back wasn't easy though, and every step created more enemies who remembered his previous conflicts. By October 6, 891, he's somehow managed to get elected pope, which is like winning the lottery except the prize comes with a really high chance of getting murdered by your political enemies. Now here's where Formosus makes his biggest mistake. The Spolitan family thinks they own the papacy, remember? They've got their guy Lambert set up as co-emperor, and they expect the pope to crown him and basically do whatever they want. But Formosus looks at Lambert and decides he'd rather crown someone else. So on February 22, 896, he crowns Arnulf of Carinthia as Holy Roman Emperor instead. You know that feeling when you're at a party and you accidentally insult the host's cooking? This was like that, except instead of awkward small talk, Formosus just declared war on the most powerful family in central Italy. The Spolitans are looking at this pope like he just keyed their cars, slept with their wives and posted about it on social media. Lambert and his mother Ageltrude are absolutely furious. These people had invested serious money and political capital in controlling the papacy, and now their pope is crowning their enemies as emperor. It's like hiring a CEO for your company and then watching him give all your trade secrets to your biggest competitor. The Spolitans start making lists of everyone who supported Formosus, and these aren't Christmas card lists if you know what I mean. Every move Formosus makes is creating more enemies. He's invalidating previous papal decisions, he's appointing bishops who are loyal to Arnulf instead of the Italian nobles, and he's basically treating the Spolitan faction like they don't exist. These are not people who forgive and forget, these are medieval Italian nobles who think revenge is a sacred duty and holding grudges is an art form. By the time Formosus dies on April 4, 896, he's managed to anger basically every powerful family in Rome except the ones who are already dead or in exile. His papal reign lasted 5 years, which actually makes him one of the longer-serving popes of this era, but those 5 years were spent making enemies who were keeping detailed notes about every slight and every political decision they disagreed with. Most rational people would figure that death ends the political game, right? When your enemy dies, you move on to the next guy and start fresh. But the Spolitans weren't rational people, and medieval Rome wasn't a place where death meant the end of your problems. Formosus probably thought dying would finally get him some peace, but he was about to discover that some enemies don't let death stop their revenge fantasies. The Spolitans had their own candidate ready to take over, and this guy was about to prove that absolute power plus unlimited hatred equals the most disturbing court case in history. That candidate was Stephen VI, who took the papal throne in May 896, and immediately showed Rome that political revenge could push someone to shockingly public vengeance. Most new popes would spend their first few months consolidating power quietly, blessing people, or updating church policies. Stephen weaponized ritual instead, making his first priority settling a score with a corpse. Stephen was basically the Spolitan family's hand-picked pope. They put him in power specifically to undo everything Formosus had done, and Stephen took this job way too seriously. The Spolitans probably told him to reverse Formosus's papal decisions, but Stephen was thinking bigger, way bigger. His papacy would last only until August 897, giving him just over a year to make his mark, and he was determined to use that time for something unprecedented. You can almost picture Stephen pacing around the Lateran palace, obsessing over how Formosus had screwed over the Spolitans and crowned the wrong emperor. Normal people would channel that anger into policy changes or political moves against Formosus's supporters. But Stephen's brain went straight to the nuclear option. Death wasn't enough for that guy. He needed to really destroy him. Here's where Stephen's plan got completely insane. He decided that the only way to truly humiliate Formosus was to prove that he was never legitimately pope in the first place. If Stephen could show that Formosus's entire papacy was illegal, then everything he did gets erased from history. It's like trying to delete someone's entire existence from the record books. Most people would try to do this with paperwork or church councils, but Stephen wanted to make it personal. Scholars still debate whether what happened next was personal madness or a calculated political show. Some historians see the coming spectacle as pure Spolitan revenge theatre. Others argue Stephen acted to shore up his own position or to erase Formosus's growing veneration among certain church factions. Either way, Stephen came up with what might be history's most disturbing legal strategy. He was going to put Formosus on trial. The fact that Formosus had been dead for 8 months didn't seem to bother Stephen at all. If anything, having a defendant who couldn't argue back probably appealed to him. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was psychological warfare against a rotting corpse, which tells you everything you need to know about how far papal politics had fallen. The plan Stephen was cooking up would make even medieval Romans uncomfortable, and these people were used to some seriously messed up papal drama. They'd seen popes get murdered, overthrown, and exiled, but nobody had ever thought to dig up a dead pope and put him on trial. Stephen was about to cross a line that even 9th century Italians thought was too far. Think about the logistics here for a second. Stephen had to convince church officials that prosecuting a corpse was a good idea. He had to organize a formal trial with proper legal procedures for a defendant who'd been decomposing in his grave for most of a year. He was basically planning to turn the Lateran Palace into the world's most disturbing courtroom for what had to be history's pettiest legal proceeding. The whole thing shows just how far Stephen was willing to go to settle this grudge. Normal revenge would be destroying Formosus's supporters or reversing his policies. Extreme revenge would be desecrating his grave or spreading lies about him, but Stephen was planning something that went way beyond normal human behavior. He wanted to formally prosecute a dead body in a court of law. You know, when someone's revenge plan involves digging up corpses, they've officially crossed every line of human decency. Stephen VI was about to prove to all of Rome that political hatred could drive people to do things so extreme they made medieval civil wars look reasonable. The most absurd courtroom drama in history was about to begin, and Stephen had spent months planning every disturbing detail. By January 897, Stephen VI was ready to execute his plan at the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the official cathedral of Rome. We're talking about the most disturbing legal proceeding in history here, and the defendant had been rotting in his grave for about 9 months. Think about the logistics for a second. Someone had to actually dig up Formosus's corpse, and I guarantee that job wasn't listed on anyone's resume under career highlights. You know, some poor church worker got assigned grave duty and spent the rest of his life trying to forget what he saw down there. They've got Formosus's decomposing body dressed up in full papal vestments like he's about to give Sunday Mass, except he's been dead since April. The corpse gets propped up on a throne like some kind of medieval Weekend at Bernie's situation, except way more disturbing and probably a lot smellier. The smell in that courtroom must have been absolutely horrific. You know that smell when something dies in your wall and you can't find it? Now imagine that times 100, wrapped in expensive papal robes and sitting in a fancy chair while church officials pretend this is normal legal procedure. Everyone in that room is trying not to gag while Stephen VI acts like prosecuting corpses is just another Tuesday in medieval Rome. The whole thing is so absurd that even the people who organized it probably can't believe they're actually doing it. And remember, this was an era when papal violence was basically routine, but even by 9th century standards, nobody had ever thought to exhume a pope and formally try him. This was breaking new ground in the crazy department. A deacon gets assigned to speak on behalf of the dead pope, which has got to be the worst defense attorney gig in history. Your client literally cannot help with his own case. He can't answer questions, provide testimony, or even stay upright without help. The deacon is basically playing ventriloquist with a rotting corpse while trying to mount a legal defense for someone who's obviously guilty of being dead. You know, this guy went home every night wondering how his career led to this moment. Stephen VI is running the whole show as prosecutor, judge, and probably jury too, because apparently conflict of interest wasn't a thing in medieval canon law. He's got formal charges drawn up like this is a real trial. Perjury, illegal transfer between sees, usurping papal authority. Basically, they're accusing a corpse of resume fraud and lying on his church application. The paperwork probably took longer to prepare than Formosus took to die. Everyone in that courtroom is trying to maintain the illusion that this is legitimate legal procedure while staring at a decomposing body in fancy clothes. Church officials are sitting there taking notes like this is normal testimony instead of a complete psychological breakdown disguised as a trial. You can almost see them looking at each other thinking the same thing. Their pope has completely lost his mind and they're all accessories to whatever this mess is supposed to be. The whole setup is so ridiculous that the corpse's biggest legal problem isn't the charges against him, it's staying upright in the chair without falling over. Formosus probably has bigger concerns than canonical violations at this point, like keeping his papal hat from sliding off what's left of his head. The defense deacon is probably more worried about the body collapsing mid-trial than actually arguing the legal points. You know what makes this even more insane? Stephen VI is about to start interrogating this corpse like it's going to answer back. He's prepared questions and everything, probably expecting some kind of response from someone who's been dead since the previous spring. The stage is set for the most absurd courtroom drama in history. You've got a dead defendant, a prosecutor who's clearly having some kind of breakdown, and a room full of church officials who are about to witness their pope attempt an actual conversation with a rotting corpse. Stephen VI launches into his interrogation and immediately proves that talking to dead people is his new specialty. A chronicler recorded Stephen yelling at the corpse, "When you were Bishop of Porto, why did you usurp the universal Roman See in such a spirit of ambition?" Then he actually waits for an answer like Formosus is going to sit up and explain himself. You know, that awkward silence when someone asks you a question and you're not sure if they're serious. Imagine that. Except one person is dead and has been for 9 months. The poor deacon assigned to defend Formosus is basically playing the world's most disturbing game of puppet theatre. This guy has to speak for someone who's literally decomposing in front of the entire courtroom while pretending this is normal legal procedure. I mean, what do you even say in that situation? Your client can't provide testimony, can't remember anything, and his biggest concern is probably staying in one piece long enough to get through the trial. Stephen VI is getting increasingly worked up during his interrogation, like he's actually expecting the corpse to start talking back. He's asking question after question, building up this dramatic prosecution, and getting frustrated when a dead body doesn't respond to his legal arguments. You can almost see him thinking, come on, just admit you were wrong about the whole emperor thing. But Formosus isn't exactly in a position to clarify his political decisions anymore. The charges Stephen brings are specific and brutal. He accuses Formosus of perjury, violating the canon forbidding translation of bishops from the 15th canon of Nicaea, and illegally holding episcopal office while technically a layman. These weren't random accusations, they were calculated attacks based on Formosus's earlier career controversies and his alleged oath at Troyes. Stephen's basically prosecuting Formosus for every political decision the Spolitans disagreed with, wrapped up in official church law. You've got church officials sitting around taking notes while their pope has a full conversation with a rotting corpse dressed in fancy clothes. Everyone's trying to maintain the illusion that this is legitimate canon law instead of Stephen dominating proceedings against a defendant who literally cannot speak in his own defense. The defense deacon is attempting to argue legal precedent while his client is falling apart in the defendant's chair. Then, right in the middle of this medieval horror show, an earthquake hits Rome. The ground starts shaking, the building starts moving, and everyone in that courtroom is thinking the exact same thing. Contemporaries read this as an ominous sign. Even God thinks this trial is completely messed up. You know when you're doing something wrong and the universe sends you a sign? This was like getting struck by lightning while robbing a church. But Stephen VI is way too far gone in his revenge fantasy to take any hints from above. The earthquake just makes him more determined to prove his point against a defendant who's been dead since last spring. He's treating this whole trial like his personal therapy session, working through years of political grudges by yelling at a corpse. The verdict is completely predictable because Stephen's running the show and the defendant can't exactly mount a defense. The defense deacon is trying his best to argue canonical precedent and church law while his client slowly decomposes in front of everyone. This poor guy probably went to law school expecting to argue normal cases about church doctrine, not defend corpses against posthumous political charges. You know he's looking at that rotting body thinking this wasn't covered in any of his legal training. It's worth noting that no full verbatim records of the Cadaver Synod survive, so the exact details come from later chroniclers who were probably as horrified as everyone else. Stephen's prosecuting with the passion of someone who's been holding this grudge for way too long. Every question gets more dramatic, every accusation gets more personal, and every moment makes it more obvious that this trial is just Stephen working through his feelings about Formosus's political decisions. The whole thing is less court of law and more medieval horror show with official paperwork. You've got legal charges, formal procedures, and proper documentation for what amounts to a pope interrogating a rotting corpse because he's still mad about stuff that happened before the defendant died. Stephen probably thought this would make him look powerful and decisive, but he was about to discover that some victories come with consequences he never saw coming. The verdict was never in doubt. Formosus gets found guilty of all charges, because apparently being dead for 9 months isn't a valid defense in Stephen VI's medieval courtroom. I mean, what did anyone expect? The defendant couldn't exactly argue his case or provide witnesses, and the judge was also the prosecutor who'd been planning this revenge fantasy for months. It's like a kangaroo court except the kangaroo is dead and wearing fancy religious clothes. Stephen VI declares all of Formosus's papal acts completely null and void, which is basically like retroactively firing someone who already quit by dying. Every priest Formosus ordained? Not legitimate anymore. Every bishop he appointed? Got to start over. Every papal decree he issued? Completely worthless. This decision threw many active clergy into complete limbo, since their ordinations suddenly meant nothing, and later church synods had to deal with the messy business of reordaining people who thought they were already priests. Stephen's basically trying to erase 5 years of church history because he didn't like the political decisions a dead guy made when he was still breathing. But here's where Stephen shows everyone just how far off the deep end he's gone. A normal person would be satisfied with the guilty verdict and the whole nullifying papal acts thing. That's already pretty extreme revenge against a corpse. But Stephen's thinking, you know what? That's not enough. I need to physically punish this dead body because apparently normal revenge doesn't satisfy my particular brand of crazy. So they strip Formosus's corpse of all the papal vestments, which is basically like taking away someone's uniform after you fire them, except way more disturbing because the person is a rotting corpse. Then Stephen orders his people to cut off the 3 fingers, a calculated attack on the very instruments he'd used to perform his papal duties. Someone had to actually mutilate a decomposing corpse while church officials stood around pretending this was normal legal procedure. After they're done with the corpse mutilation, they dump Formosus in a graveyard for foreigners, which is basically the ancient equivalent of putting someone in the worst neighborhood possible. This isn't where popes are supposed to be buried. This is where random travelers who die in Rome get thrown when nobody knows what else to do with them. It's the ultimate insult to a guy who used to be the most powerful religious figure in Europe. But Stephen's still not satisfied with his revenge plot, because apparently even grave desecration isn't enough for this guy. They dig up Formosus again and throw his body in the Tiber River like he's medieval garbage disposal. Picture Romans walking along the riverbank and seeing a former pope's corpse floating downstream. That's not exactly the kind of thing you expect to see during your morning walk, you know, though monks or supporters later managed to recover the body from the river and eventually got him reburied properly, but that's getting ahead of the story. The public reaction is immediate horror, and we're talking about people who were already used to some seriously messed up papal drama. Medieval Romans had seen popes get murdered, overthrown and exiled, but nobody had ever witnessed corpse mutilation as official church policy. People are watching what's left of Formosus float down the river and thinking their current pope has completely lost his mind. I mean, when your revenge plot involves river disposal of dead bodies, you've officially crossed the line from political ruthlessness to complete insanity. Stephen probably thought this whole spectacle would make him look powerful and decisive. You know, show everyone what happens when you mess with the Spolitan family. But instead he just proved that revenge can make people do things that destroy their own credibility. The trial backfires so spectacularly that even Romans who supported the Spolitans are thinking maybe their pope needs some serious intervention. Stephen VI just transformed himself from pope with political enemies into pope who's obviously dangerous, and normal people don't support corpse mutilation even in medieval Rome. Turns out prosecuting dead bodies is a really bad look when you're trying to maintain any kind of credibility as a religious leader. The public outrage was immediate and brutal. Romans who had tolerated papal murders and political coups suddenly decided that corpse interrogation crossed every line of human decency. Within months of the Cadaver Synod, the same political forces that put Stephen in power were eyeing him like a rabid dog that needed to be put down. You can almost picture the conversations in Roman noble houses. Hey, remember when we thought Stephen would be a good pope because he hated Formosus? Yeah, well, turns out he's completely insane. We might have made a mistake. The Spolitan family probably started looking around for a new puppet who wouldn't embarrass them by talking to dead bodies in public. Stephen gets deposed and thrown in prison by July or August 897, less than a year after the trial. The guy probably spent his last few weeks thinking his revenge plot was totally worth it, right up until he realized it completely destroyed his life. You know that feeling when you do something you think is clever and then immediately realize it was the stupidest decision you've ever made? Stephen's having that moment, except instead of embarrassing himself at a party, he embarrassed himself in front of all of medieval Europe. Here's where karma gets really brutal though. Stephen VI gets strangled to death in prison, which proves that justice in medieval Rome was swift, violent and absolutely final. I'm just saying, the same people who were okay with putting corpses on trial suddenly decided that murdering popes was back on the menu. You know your revenge plot backfired when you end up getting the same treatment you probably wanted to give your enemies. Pope Theodore II takes over in December 897 and immediately starts damage control like his life depends on it, which it probably does. This guy convenes a synod and declares the whole Cadaver Synod completely invalid. Every decision Stephen made, worthless. Every charge against Formosus, thrown out. Theodore's basically doing the papal equivalent of hitting the reset button and hoping everyone forgets about the corpse trial. He orders Formosus reburied with full papal honours in St. Peter's Basilica, which means someone had to fish the former pope's body out of the Tiber River and give him a proper funeral. John IX continues the clean-up operation in 890 by holding synods in Rome and Ravenna to condemn the whole mess. These synods affirmed Theodore's reversal, ordered the destruction of all records from the Cadaver Synod, excommunicated several cardinals who participated, and officially prohibited future trials of corpses. The Church is basically doing serious damage control, trying to pretend the zombie trial never happened while everyone in Europe is still talking about it. You know when you do something embarrassing and try to act like it didn't happen but everyone keeps bringing it up? The Catholic Church is having that experience on a continental scale. Modern historians actually disagree about who really ordered the Cadaver Synod in the first place. Earlier accounts blamed Lambert and his mother Ageltrude, but recent research suggests the motivations were more complex and that Lambert may have even approved of Formosus's rehabilitation later. The whole thing gets even messier when you realize that political factions were constantly shifting allegiances based on whoever seemed to be winning that week. But here's the weird part. The story doesn't end with Theodore's cleanup. Pope Sergius III later comes along and reverses some of the rehabilitations, reaffirming earlier judgments against Formosus. So even after Stephen got strangled for his corpse trial, the political hatred that started this whole mess kept bubbling up in different forms. It's like a medieval soap opera that just won't end. Stephen's revenge plot didn't just fail spectacularly, it made Formosus look like a martyr and Stephen look like a complete psychopath. The guy who was supposed to be the victim ends up getting reburied with honors while the guy who organized it gets strangled in prison. That's got to be the worst possible outcome for a revenge fantasy. The whole episode became this perfect example of how political hatred can spiral completely out of control when people lose all sense of normal human behavior. The Cadaver Synod proved that political revenge, weaponized as ritual, can backfire so spectacularly it becomes a cautionary tale for centuries. Stephen VI tried to achieve damnatio memoriae, erasing Formosus from history, but instead created the most embarrassing papal scandal ever recorded. This whole mess shows how memory and power get contested when people lose all sense of normal human behavior. The crazy parts are historically documented, and scholars have studied this incident extensively. So, yeah, this actually happened. Stephen thought he was being clever, that he just proved that some victories aren't worth winning. Which revenge in history would you rate the wildest, and why? Drop your pick below. At least modern cancel culture doesn't involve tossing bodies in rivers.